Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Alliance's webinar series. Today is Tuesday, May 24th, 2016, and we are excited to bring to you today the ADA game webinar. So we're going to have some time and learning about the ADA and sharing information about the ADA and how it may impact each of us in our lives and how we support folks. My name is Christine Beck, and I will be starting off our webinar today. So welcome, everyone. A bit about today's webinar. We want you to get ready to participate. So we are going to ask you at different times to talk amongst yourselves, especially if you're with a group, and to share your questions or share your answers by using the control panel. And we will read those questions and answers out loud so that everybody can benefit. We also want you to know how many questions can you answer. You know, life is enough of a test. So we're not going to take a grade on this. And it's just a simple refresher. So we all want to have some fun learning with each other and teaching each other. So the Alliance, we are a network of self-advocacy groups all around Illinois. And we have 25 self-advocacy groups who call themselves members of the Alliance. And we have member groups in McHenry and Zion, also in Alsop, Brookfield, Chicago, Chicago Heights, Homewood, and Joliet. We have groups in Rock Island, Pontiac, LaSalle, Peru, Beardstown, Jacksonville, and Bloomington. We also have groups in Bloomington, Decatur, Champaign, Monticello, Charleston, Alton, and the Alton, Edwardsville, Riverbend area. So we have lots of self-advocates who are speaking up and speaking out, not only in their own lives, but in their agencies and organizations, in their communities, and throughout the state. So whether you are a self-advocate or an ally, we so appreciate everything you do in terms of self-advocacy. So let's get ready. Put on your thinking caps. How many of you know history? When was the ADA, or it's also called the Americans with Disabilities Act, actually signed into law? So who knows the year? What year was the ADA signed into law? So maybe talk amongst yourselves. No getting out your smartphone or your iPad or on your computer to Google that. Let's see how well we remember. When was the ADA actually signed into law? This is kind of a hard one. I'm not a good historian, so I'm learning right along with you. All right, we have one suggestion from Self-Advocates of Lake County, way up in Zion, almost Kentucky, Wisconsin. 1982? Well, I don't know. We're going to find out. Anybody else have any other ideas? When was the ADA actually signed into law? And we know it takes a little while for things to get signed into law. Many of us have participated in putting legislation forth and it going through the House of Representatives and the Senate and all the different things that have to happen before the governor signs it into law. So it is quite a process. All right, we have from RGA Council, they have 1970. From CTF Advocacy Center, they say 1983. All right, so drum roll please. When was it signed into law? Wow, later than we all thought. It was signed into law July 26th, 1990. And you can see that then President Bush is signing it into law. But again, it was in the works for many, many years prior to that time. And the ADA has provided benefits to many, many of us. And it's not just for people with intellectual disabilities, it's people with all disabilities. Because at some point, we are all going to experience disabilities, aren't we? So let's learn some more. Here's a question. The Americans with Disabilities Act, it really is about 5 major sections, and those are called titles. And each of the titles protects people with disabilities from facing discrimination in different aspects of their lives. Can you name all 5 titles, or can you name any of the titles? I know I couldn't name all 5 titles, and I'm not sure I could get 2 titles, but what are your ideas? What are the sections or the titles? There's 5 of them, but give a guess, or maybe you know for sure. Any of them. So go ahead and talk amongst yourselves, come up with your answers, and type them in using the control panel. So do you know any of the sections or titles that make up the Americans with Disabilities Act? Let's see how we're all doing, shall we? All right. Let's see. Okay, Self-Advocates of Lake County. They must have had their Wheaties this morning because they are coming in loud and strong. They have said housing, employment, and education. All right, as 3 of those titles. So we got the Wheaties and the coffee going up there in Zion, Illinois. They have said housing, employment, and education as 3 of the major sections. So anybody else? Anybody else out there? What are the major titles or sections that make up this thing we call the Americans with Disabilities Act? All right, here we go. All right, RGA Council in Chicago, they've had their Wheaties today too. They said employment, transportation, and air carrier access. And they also said voting, access to voting. All right. So far, between RGA Council and Self-Advocates of Lake County, we have the following as major sections: employment, housing, education, transportation, and voting. Anybody else want to chime in before we start to figure these things out together? And I know we're all going to be stronger advocates because we have learned together. All right, let's see. Title I is employment. Whoop, whoop, whoop. So if you suggested employment, give yourselves a big round of applause. Oh, RGA Council also said accessibility. So I'm going to write that down. Thank you so much for that entry. All right. So Title I has to do with employment. And I know employment is a huge thing for many people. We are unemployed or underemployed. And we want to be working in jobs that make us feel good, that we are contributing and make us money. So Title I says employers can't discriminate against people with disabilities on the job. It is illegal for an employer to discriminate against a person with a disability on the job. It also says that employers must provide reasonable accommodations for their workers with disabilities unless the employer can prove it would cause an undue hardship. So, you know, we have to look and see what reasonable accommodations do people need in order to do their job, and then we have to communicate that with our supervisors or employers. But if there's an accommodation that we need that would cause the employer undue hardship, they'd have to spend too much money to provide that accommodation, or they wouldn't be able to provide the service or good they're trying to provide if they have to do that accommodation, that may be a reason that a person with a disability would not, would not be able to get a job. Oh, RGA Council. All right. They also said one of the 5 major titles is telecommunications. So we're going to find that out. So Title 1 is about employment. So here's a question. What is a reasonable accommodation? What would be a reasonable accommodation that an employer would be able to provide a worker who has a disability? And remember, if you are an employee or a worker with a disability and you need an accommodation, you need to let somebody know. An employer isn't just going to look at you and decide what kind of accommodation you need. You need to know yourself. You need to know what support you need, what accommodation, and you need to communicate that. All right, so what is a reasonable accommodation? So here we go. An accessible bathroom. Absolutely. Some people need an accessible bathroom. And you know, if we're working several hours on the job, the likelihood is we're going to need to use the washroom at some point. So yes, RGA Council, you got it, an accessible bathroom. And we'll learn more about ADA, the different sections in terms of accessibility in buildings and environments. All right, wow, these are all great. These are all great answers. So Self-Advocates of Lake County said a voice-activated computer software. Yeah, for some people where typing is difficult, having voice-activated computer software. And we know that voice-activated computer software is available. There is a variety of price ranges, but again, if you are someone who needs that accommodation, you need to let your employer know and then help them research what those options may be for you. CTF Advocacy Center. Sometimes a quiet place to work. Well, you know what? Sometimes we do need a quiet place to work, free of different distractions and noises and activities. And that can be a reasonable accommodation. There may be some variables, though. If you are applying to work in a factory, on a factory line, and as a line worker, it may not be reasonable for them to provide a quiet place for you to work because the work is on a factory line, on a factory floor. But again, remember, speak up in terms of what you want and what you need in order to perform the job. Okay, accessible sinks. Yes, people need accessible sinks. Ramps and fire exits are accessible. Absolutely. We need to make sure that when we talk about building accessibility under the ADA, that buildings are accessible, that in an emergency, we are able to get out safely, just like anybody else would be able to access things safely. And the last one, accessible parking. Yeah, letting employers know I need accessible parking in order to get to work and to park. These are reasonable accommodations. So let's go to the next one. here's an answer to that. What is a reasonable accommodation? And you guys gave me tons of examples, which are awesome. It's an adjustment made to the workplace based on the needs of the worker. And remember, it cannot provide or prove to be a hardship on the employer. And probably 95 to 99% of the time, a reasonable accommodation is really pretty simple and not very costly, if costly at all. And it's just communication. And when we communicate our needs to our employer, we're giving them more insight and a deeper understanding of how do we provide accommodations to other people. All right, let's see. Self-Advocates of Lake County. Yeah, you know what else we need? Restaurants that are truly accessible. You know, Self-Advocates of Lake County, thank you for sharing that. I go to lots of places and I hear from lots of people that there still are restaurants and other places in the state of Illinois, and I'm sure in our own communities and around the world, that are not fully accessible for everyone. And I think it's really important that businesses providing goods and services need to understand that people with disabilities have money to spend, and we have purchasing power just like everybody else, and we want to come into your establishment and use goods and services. But we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. What is an undue hardship? Now, I talked about that a little bit. So what is an undue hardship? We talked about an employer having to provide reasonable accommodations unless it's an undue hardship. So what are your ideas on what an undue hardship may be? So go ahead and talk amongst yourselves. Look at that cute little bird. He wants to know, cheep, cheep, what's an undue hardship? What's an undue hardship? Okay, let's see. Something that could be costly to a small agency. Yeah, you're absolutely right, CTF Advocacy Center. Something that could be costly is an undue hardship. Another idea from Self-Advocates of Lake County, if businesses could lose money based on the accommodation. Yeah, that's a good, wow, that's something to think about. I hadn't thought of it in that way. Self-Advocates of Lake County, if a business would lose money based on the accommodation. You know what, RGA Council, I think it's a challenge. You've said challenge for someone to provide the service or job. And a lot of times, again, people may think it is an undue hardship, but perhaps it's working together, both the employee and the employer, and maybe it's getting some other entities involved, like the local Center for Independent Living, and maybe it's about brainstorming. Okay, this person is able to do this job, and he or she needs a particular accommodation. Before you just write that person off saying, no, it's undue hardship, let's brainstorm. How might we be able to make this happen? I think sometimes we don't do enough in exhausting the possibilities before we say, you know, I've thought about it every way. We've consulted with some experts. We've had lots of great conversation to deepen the understanding, and I'm just not sure we're able to do it at this time. So here is an answer for what is undue hardship. But before I do that, yeah, RGA Council, that's a great insight. No room to improve the current situation. Yeah, that might be an undue hardship, as sad as that sounds, because I think we can always improve the current situation. Maybe not in the way we always think we can, but I think just opening our minds to the possibilities. So the answer to what is an undue hardship, excuse me, an employer can claim an accommodation is an undue hardship when he or she can prove that in carrying out the accommodation, it would cost a great deal of money, time, or productivity. So is it going to cost me a great deal of money? Is it going to cost me a great deal of time to do the accommodation, or is it going to cost in productivity? And you know, I don't know who makes the ultimate decision. I suppose the employer does. But again, it's that opening up those lines of communication, because there's a lot of employers out there who have never had an employee with a disability, and I think they may be scared. They may not know how to provide supports or accommodations, and they may just assume it's going to be too much. You know, they're ignorant. They just don't know. But again, we can get out there as self-advocates, even in our own communities, and be talking about, you know, what are the things we can do? What are the things we like to do? How can we help you in your businesses? So Title II, which is one of those 5, we just went through employment, and the second is transportation. So a couple of you said transportation, and if you did, whoop, 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 give yourselves a round of applause. So Title II has to do with public entities and public transportation. It also requires accessible access to local and state governmental buildings and access to accessible transportation. Now, I know there's a lot of conversation and thought about what is accessible transportation, because I know I hear from self-advocates and they say, you know, the bus doesn't run after a certain time of the day, or it doesn't run on weekends or holidays, and that's not accessible to me to live the life I want to live. And so there are some different definitions, I think, of accessibility, but Title II requires that accessible access happens to local and state governmental buildings. So, you know, your restaurants and other things, they are exempt from that, although restaurants and other businesses that, you know, want the business should be accessible. And it also talks about access to accessible transportation. So Title III has to do with goods and services, and that means that businesses have to be accessible. And so we did talk about restaurants, and I know there is a really great organization that has not only, I know they have a website, and they're in the Chicago area, although they are statewide. It's called JJ's List, and it is done by JJ Hanley. And people can log on to JJ's List, and they can give a review of different businesses in their area that they've gone to, and let JJ's List know, is that business accessible? Is the business not accessible? And if the business is not accessible, JJ's List will look into it, and they'll contact that business and say, you know, what is it we can do to help you to become more accessible? There are people with disabilities in your community that have said they wanted to use your business, or they tried to use their business and it wasn't accessible. What can we do to change that? So again, that's called JJ's List. Title IV requires companies to provide telecommunication devices for people with hearing impairment. So I know RGA Council, give yourselves a round of applause. You talked about telecommunications. So back in the day, and people still use telecommunication devices for the deaf, or TTYs or TTDs, and some people still use them, but there's also other avenues that telecommunication can be provided for people with not only hearing impairments, but people who have speech impairments. It allows them to type and then someone to speak to the person to whom they wish to connect with. So Title IV is about telecommunications. And Title V prohibits retaliation against individuals who enforce their rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So this says if you file a complaint against an employer saying that, you know what, I have asked for reasonable accommodation. I am a person with a disability. I have asked for reasonable accommodation and they did not provide that to me. You can file a complaint and the employer can't get mad at you and say, well, you know what, you told on me, you file a complaint, so now I'm going to fire you. They can't fire you for speaking up for your rights. Similarly, if an accommodation is ruled to be an undue hardship, the employee can't file that complaint again. So if you have asked for an accommodation at a business and the employer said, I'm unable to do it because it is an undue hardship, you only get one time to file a complaint with the Americans with Disabilities Act. That's what it says. All right, so any questions, and I'll try to answer them. I'm not as schooled in the ADA as other people are. I'm certainly not as schooled in the ADA as Megan Norland is. But do you have any questions, and how do we continue to help the ADA change and evolve? And I know we've already talked a little bit about that. You know, we've talked about we have to know ourselves and we have to let people know when we need accommodations. People are not going to read our minds. They're not going to look at us and think they know what we need or what we don't. So we really need to understand ourselves and be able to communicate in whatever way that works best for you with other people about, this is what I need. I can do this job, but this is what I need. Or, this is what I need to use this business. This is what I need in terms of telecommunications, or this is what I need in terms of accessible transportation. So how do we continue to help it change? Let's hear your ideas. All right. RGA Council, you got it. Keep speaking out. Exactly. Are you satisfied with the way things are right now? If you are, great. And if you're not, keep speaking out. Another way, RGA Council said that how can we continue to help the ADA change and evolve? Well, additional funding, certainly additional funding for agencies and businesses and other entities to make those reasonable accommodations happen. Making sure that there's some funding available for those things to happen. Oh, this is a good question. This is from Self-Advocates of Lake County. What does the ADA do after a complaint has been filed? Well, I've never, I don't exactly know the process. What I can imagine, after a complaint has been filed with the Americans with Disabilities Act, or, I would imagine that a representative comes and speaks to the person who filed the complaint, the person with the disability, and finds out what happened, you know, kind of get some background history. And then I would also imagine that that same representative who is investigating that complaint would also speak to people at the business, whether it is the employer, somebody in human resources, or the supervisor. So I'd imagine there's an investigation process, and then they look at the information and they make their determination. You know, though that's a good question to have, though, and maybe it provides some additional learning opportunities for folks. Maybe you Google what happens when you file an ADA complaint. Do some more learning on that, right? We have to be active pursuers of knowledge, active learners in our own life. So another thing from Self-Advocates of Lake County, we can continue to help by telling others and the ADA about the issues we are facing. Absolutely. That's about speaking up and speaking out, right? We need to share information with our community and community leaders. Yeah, so maybe there's stuff in your community that you can share with the business owner, maybe with the mayor or the city council or village council, depending on how your local community is set up. Certainly, it's letting our legislators know when something's going well and when something isn't. But it's always looking for what is our next one right step. How do we get to the next level where things are totally accessible and totally equal, irregardless of disability? Another great idea from Self-Advocates of Lake County, educating new staff. Yeah, you know what? Educating new staff about the basics of the Americans with Disabilities Act, because there are times that staff are supporting people and they're taking them to different places in the community, and staff can see different things, you know, that maybe aren't ADA compliant, and they can help speak up as well. So that's good to know, especially staff as it relates to some of our staff in employment services, as they are helping support people and going out and looking for jobs in community employers, you know, making sure that they understand how the ADA impacts employees with disabilities. So that's a great idea, educating new staff. Educating new staff. Does anybody else have any questions, comments, or considerations? Questions, comments, or considerations? I think everybody gets a gold star, gets 100%, because we all learned something today. We all learned something, absolutely. So again, any questions, comments, or contributions people would like to add? While you're thinking of any, I'll go to this screen, and then just to remind you, the Alliance is always available to our member groups and to other self-advocates and groups who aren't member groups. But the Alliance contact information, you can contact Megan Norland, Tara Wicki, myself, Christine Beck, or Leanne Roth. We encourage folks to check out our website. And, you know, our Facebook page really is gathering a lot of momentum. So we really encourage people to find and like our Facebook page. All right, we have something from Self-Advocates down in CTF Advocacy Center, Charleston, Illinois, representing. This was fun. Well, great. I'm glad you had fun. You know, challenge yourselves to learn more. I know the ADA is a lot more involved than what we covered. You could probably take a semester of college classes all about the ADA, right? But learn more. If you still have questions in your own mind, if you don't know how to use the computer, find somebody who does, and Google those questions and get the information. And engage yourself in your learning for your life. Does anybody else have anything to share? Any questions, comments, or considerations before we end our May webinar? Any questions, comments, or considerations? So nothing's coming through, and so on behalf of the Alliance, who is really all of you self-advocates, you all make it happen, and to our allies, we couldn't do it without you. And on behalf of Megan and Tara and Leanne, we so appreciate everything you do. We are eager to continue the journey of speaking up and speaking out. So until next time, everyone, this is Christine Beck. Have a great day. And again, keep on speaking up and speaking out. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.